All right, on July 25th, 2026, the European Union passed its 21st sanctions package against Russia. And if you read the morning papers, you would think this is a victory. CNN said the EU is tightening the vice on Moscow. BBC called it the most decisive action Brussels has ever taken. 50 more ships added to the blacklist, the oil price cap maintained. It all sounds very impressive, but here's the thing. Nobody read the fine print. Because buried deep inside this sanctions package, and I mean buried, we are talking about one paragraph in a document that runs to hundreds of pages. There is one clause, one sentence. And that one sentence changes everything. It says that EU member states are permitted to sell Russian oil seized from sanctioned vessels into their domestic markets. Okay? Let that sit for a moment. This is not a sanctions package. This is the European Union legally buying Russian oil under a different name. And not a single major news outlet is talking about it. But here is what makes this even more important. That clause is just the first layer. Because when you peel back the next layer, you find out that America is quietly considering sending special forces into Iranian nuclear facilities that Iran has already booby-trapped in anticipation. You find out that Iran has drawn up a new list of targets inside Israel, targets that, and I quote, cannot be repaired or rebuilt for years. And that list gets activated automatically if America strikes Pickaxe Mountain, even without Israeli participation. And you find out that Iran's foreign ministry spokesman is using Hannah Arendt's exact philosophical terminology to destroy the European Union's moral credibility in front of the entire world. In the next 32 minutes, I'm going to take you through every single layer. All right, let us begin. Before I get into the numbers, I want to introduce a concept. I call it the self-destroying loop. The idea is simple. When an empire is declining, it creates policies that look strong on the surface, but actually make it weaker. Every action that solves problem A creates problem B. Solving B creates a bigger problem C. And the cycle continues until the whole thing collapses under its own weight. That is a self-destroying loop. Think about it like this. Imagine a man running away from the rain. He runs into a house, but the house is flooding. He climbs onto the roof, but the roof is rotting. Every escape move puts him in a worse situation. Does that make sense? That is the self-destroying loop. And this is exactly what is happening to the United States of America right now. Let me walk you through it step by step. Step 1. The United States attacks Iran on February 28, 2026. Operation Epic Fury. The stated reason, prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. The real reason, as I have analyzed in previous lectures, is to stop the Russia-China-Iran axis from forming and to protect the petrodollar system. Step 2. Iran responds by blockading the Strait of Hormuz. And here is the number I want you to remember. 25% of all seaborne oil in the world. 20% of all seaborne liquefied natural gas in the world blocked. Brent crude shoots up to $126 a barrel. Step 3. The energy shock hits Europe like a freight train. Germany is the most vulnerable. They already lost cheap Russian gas after 2022. Now they are losing Middle Eastern oil. The German economy goes into free fall. They need energy. They need it now. Step 4. Who has oil to sell? Russia. And Europe is buying, even if a new sanctions package existed, even through channels they would never publicly acknowledge. Step 5. Ukraine, backed by Washington, attacks Russian oil infrastructure. Russia extends its fuel export ban through the end of 2026. Less oil on the global market. Europe gets more desperate. Europe needs to buy even more Russian oil through whatever mechanism they can find. Back to step 4. The loop is complete. America attacks Iran. Europe runs out of energy. Europe buys Russian oil. Russia gets stronger. American alliances fracture. America has to prove its strength. America attacks Iran harder. The loop repeats. That is the self-destroying loop. And today I'm going to show you how it operates at 4 different levels simultaneously. Now let me break down what EU Sanctions Package 21 actually does, because this is the centerpiece of everything. On the surface, the package looks tough. 50 ships added to the blacklist. Oil price cap maintained at $44.10 per barrel. Major news outlets look at that and say the EU is getting serious, okay? But buried in the legal text is this mechanism Member states may sell Russian oil seized from sanctioned vessels into their domestic markets. Think about what this means. Imagine you have a friend who publicly declares he is quitting cigarettes, but then he adds, if somebody gives me cigarettes, I'm allowed to smoke them. Is that quitting? Of course not. That is finding a legal excuse to keep doing what you are already doing. This is exactly what the EU is doing. They cannot buy Russian oil directly. That violates the sanctions. But they can seize Russian tankers, then sell the oil from those tankers into their domestic market, legally, completely legally. Analysts are calling this principled pragmatism, meaning they still publicly condemn Russia, but quietly absorb Russian energy to save themselves. I want to give you the specific number that proves this was happening even before Package 21 existed. From January to April 2026, that is 4 months, before this new package even passed, the European Union imported liquefied natural gas from Russia's Yamal Arctic project worth 3 billion British pounds. 3 billion. And that figure represented 98%, not 50%, not 70%, 98% of the total output of the Yamal project. The EU was secretly keeping alive the very Russian energy project it was supposed to be sanctioning. Here's what that tells you. The EU did not start buying Russian energy because of Package 21. Package 21 is the legal formalization of what was already happening in the shadows. This is not a new policy. This is an old reality getting a new stamp of approval. So now I want to tell you about a story that is almost too absurd to believe, but it happened. And it tells you everything about the self-destroying loop. On July 25th, a tanker chartered by Chevron, one of the largest oil companies in America, was transporting Kazakhstani oil through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium route across the Black Sea. Now, this CPC route is significant. Washington spent years building this pipeline specifically so that Europe could reduce its dependence on Russian energy. It is the backup plan, the alternative supply route that is supposed to replace Russian oil. A Ukrainian drone struck that ship. Let that land. A Ukrainian drone hit an American company's tanker on the exact pipeline route that America built to replace Russian oil. And what happened next? Chevron called Washington, and the Trump administration had to pick up the phone and tell Zelensky, their strategic partner, the country they have been funding with tens of billions of dollars, to stop attacking non-Russian ships on the Black Sea. America is fighting Iran to protect Europe's energy supply lines. But America's own ally is destroying the alternative energy supply lines with drones. And now America has to reprimand its own ally to protect its own company's oil shipment. That is the self-destroying loop at its most absurd level. Now I want to talk about something that almost no political commentator has analyzed properly, because it is a sentence, just a sentence. But it is one of the most devastating diplomatic attacks I have seen in years. This week, Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei published a statement responding to EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas, who had expressed human rights concerns about Iran, and Baghai's response was this: the EU cannot simultaneously profess a commitment to human rights while providing logistical and technical support for lethal attacks on Iranian civilians and critical national infrastructure. The EU refuses to condemn war crimes. The EU offers no sympathy for Iranian children killed by American and Israeli bombs, and therefore Baghai said the EU's position represents, in his exact words, the banality of evil and the purest form of hypocrisy. Okay? Now, why does this specific phrase matter so much? The banality of evil is not a random expression. It is the exact term that philosopher Hannah Arendt used to describe Nazi officials who carried out the Holocaust. Not because they were monsters who enjoyed cruelty, but because they were bureaucrats who simply followed procedures without thinking about the moral consequences. They were doing their jobs, signing documents, attending meetings, processing paperwork, while people died. Iran is saying the exact same thing about the EU. The EU is not an active villain. The EU is just following procedures, signing agreements, attending summits, issuing human rights statements. While Iranian civilians are being killed by bombs launched from bases that used European territory, that bureaucratic indifference, that is the banality of evil. And here's the context that makes this attack devastating. The EU just legalized buying Russian oil through Package 21. The EU is preaching human rights to Iran. The EU provided bases for American strikes on Iran. The The EU refused to join the American naval coalition in Hormuz. The EU is simultaneously on every side of this conflict at the same time. Magahe just handed the entire global south a philosophical framework to explain why the EU has no moral standing to lecture anyone about anything. That is not rhetoric. That is a precision strike on European credibility in front of 4 billion people who are watching this conflict very carefully. Now I want to talk about the real winner in this story. And it is not the United States, it is not Iran, the real winner is Russia. Russia is not fighting in Iran. Not one Russian soldier has died in the Persian Gulf. Not one Russian aircraft has flown over the Middle East. But the Hormuz blockade has pushed global oil prices to levels generating enormous budget revenues for Moscow without Russia paying a single additional cent in military costs. Now think about this number. Iran, the country being bombed every night, earned $18 billion from oil sales during this conflict, $11.5 billion during the active war phase, another $6.5 billion during the ceasefire window. That represents more than 60% of the oil revenue projected in Iran's entire annual budget, despite a full naval blockade and maximum economic pressure. If Iran can do that while being bombed, imagine what Russia is earning when nobody is dropping a single bomb on them. And then on July 25th, Putin announced he is extending Russia's fuel export ban through the end of 2026. The official reason, stabilizing domestic supply after Ukraine struck the Tyumen refinery in Siberia, more than 2,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and the Filonovsky drilling platform in the Caspian Sea. The practical effect, less fuel on the global market, higher prices, more EU desperation, more EU need to seize Russian tankers and sell oil under Package 21, the loop tightens. Russia is squeezing Europe from behind, while Europe is shooting itself in the foot from the front. And the only party truly benefiting is Moscow. Now here is the piece of this story that almost nobody is covering correctly. And I want you to pay close attention because this is the kind of thing that only becomes visible when you read between the lines. Over the weekend of July 24th and 25th, the Wall Street Journal reported that Bahrain and Kuwait secretly dispatched fighter jets to strike military targets inside Iranian territory in early July. This was not logistical support. This was a direct military strike. So what was Kuwait's response? The Emir of Kuwait publicly stated clearly and explicitly, Kuwait has not permitted the use of our land, airspace, or waters for any military action against Iran. And Kuwait's ambassador to the United States sent a letter to the Wall Street Journal calling the report completely baseless, affirming that Kuwait had not participated in any military operations against Iran. So who conducted those strikes in Kuwaiti territory? Here is the key insight. Think of Kuwait like a house. The homeowner, the Kuwaiti government, says they never authorized anything. But inside that house there are tenants, US military forces at Ali Al Salem Air Base, Camp Arifjan, Camp Doha, and Camp Udaiwi. And those tenants are operating under Washington's orders, not the homeowners. The Kuwaiti state and the American military, based on Kuwaiti soil, are two completely separate entities operating independently on the same territory. The Kuwaiti government wants neutrality. The American military stationed there does not. And Iran does not separate those two entities. General Akraminia of the Iranian Armed Forces stated publicly this week that in its retaliatory operations, Iran placed US bases in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, which he described as among the most important American bases in the region, at the center of retaliatory action, not just the bases, the surrounding territory. Kuwaiti civilians are paying the consequences of a war their government never agreed to join, launched from their soil by forces their government cannot control. And the question I want you to carry, when American military forces use Kuwaiti territory to strike Iran without the explicit authorization of the Kuwaiti government, is that an alliance or is that an occupation? All right. Now I want to give the opposing view the strongest possible presentation before I explain why I think it ultimately falls apart. The Steelman argument goes like this. Professor, you are overstating the problem. The EU is still genuinely sanctioning Russia. Package 21 still blacklists 50 more ships. The oil price cap is still in effect. These are real constraints on Moscow. On the Kuwait question, that is unconfirmed intelligence. And the pause in American airstrikes is genuine evidence that Washington is trying diplomacy. And at the end of the day, America has massively degraded Iranian military capacity. The Navy is gone. 250 fighter jets no longer fly. That is not failure. That is the most successful military degradation campaign in decades. That argument has real merit in certain areas. Legally, Package 21 is still a sanctions package. Politically, we can understand why Europe has to find workarounds in an energy crisis of this magnitude. But here are the things that argument cannot explain. First, when you create a mechanism letting you seize Russian tankers and sell their oil domestically, you create an incentive to seize more tankers. More seizures means more Russian oil flowing into European markets. This mechanism can operate indefinitely as a parallel import channel running alongside the official embargo. That is not a temporary workaround. That is a new institutional architecture for buying Russian oil. Second, 3 billion pounds of Yamal LNG imported from January to April, before Package 21 even existed, proves the EU was already buying Russian energy through other channels. Package 21 did not create this behavior. It legitimized behavior that was already happening in the shadows. That is a fundamental difference. Third, Republican Senator Tim Sheehy became emotional on the Senate floor this week, recalling a friend killed by an Iranian bomb. He said, "We did not start this war, but we will finish it." That kind of domestic political pressure means Trump cannot exit easily even if he wanted to. Spain refused to let the US use Rota and Moran air bases to strike Iran. Germany, Italy, and Spain refused to join the American naval coalition to reopen Hormuz. France refused to join the Gaza Peace Initiative. Trump threatened 200% tariffs on French and Spanish wine in retaliation. These are not signs of a functioning alliance. These are signs of an alliance disintegrating in slow motion. And as for the military degradation claim, I want to address that in the next section. Because what the CIA is privately telling the White House about Iran's remaining military capacity is very different from what Trump said at the Correspondents' Dinner. The Trump administration is calling the pause in airstrikes a diplomatic window, creating space for Omani-mediated negotiations. It sounds statesmanlike. But let us look at what is actually happening inside the building. Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane raised urgent concerns at a White House meeting on Friday about the rapid depletion of Patriot missile interceptors at U.S. Central Command. The New York Times confirmed it. The Pentagon confirmed operations were, quote, on hold, and the Pentagon has quietly revised the U.S. military death count from 18 confirmed fatalities down to 14. Not because they miscounted, because they are managing the information flow. America's air defense was already breached. 3 American soldiers were killed in Jordan when an Iranian strike got through the defensive perimeter. After 13 consecutive nights of bombing, the Patriot stockpile is critically low. This diplomatic pause is a logistics pause, and Washington is staring at 3 options, every single one dangerous in a different way. Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing Trump to escalate with ground forces, seize islands in the Persian Gulf, establish positions on the Iranian coast. And Trump this week said he is considering an attack bigger than any previous strike. 2 forces are pulling against each other inside the White House right now. Well, here is what Iran's army spokesman General Xueqin said publicly this week. And I want you to pay close attention to this. He said, "The situation is chaotic and undesirable for America." Then he added something extraordinary. "The possibility of America withdrawing from this war is conditional on Israel's permission." An Iranian general is publicly describing the exact trap Washington is in. To exit, America needs Israel's agreement, and Israel does not want to stop. America's own ally is the lock on the exit door. And the military reality of a ground invasion is grimmer than the public statements suggest. A classified CIA assessment delivered to the White House estimates that Iran's ballistic missile program is still approximately 70% intact after all the bombing. 70%? America has destroyed only 30% of Iran's missile capability after months of intensive strikes. Satellite imagery confirmed this week by Fox News and former U.S. Defense Secretary Esper, Tehran is rapidly restoring its military capabilities, including missile and drone programs. Iran is using Chinese satellite imagery to pinpoint the exact positions of American Patriot systems and THAAD batteries across the region. They then use drone swarms, the same tactic Russia perfected in Ukraine, flooding the air defense network with cheap expendable drones to exhaust the interceptor stockpile, then launching real ballistic missiles into the gaps that open up. Iran's IRGC this week claimed it destroyed 11 American aircraft at regional bases between July 8th and 22nd, an F-15 inside a hardened shelter, a P-8 maritime patrol aircraft, a C-17 transport, and 8 refueling tankers. The U.S. has not confirmed these losses, but critically, it has also not denied them. Add the terrain problem. Iran is vast. The Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges, desert regions, dense urban centers, separated by enormous distances. Any invasion force needs to protect supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers while under constant attack. And there is a nationalism factor. A significant portion of Iranians do not support the Islamic Republic, but the moment foreign boots land on Iranian soil, that internal division disappears. Nationalism unites people against the invader. America would not be welcomed as liberators. It would be fighting a multi-layered guerrilla resistance with no exit strategy, worse than Iraq, worse than Afghanistan, because the opponent is larger, better armed, and has been preparing for this exact scenario for years. So, if full-scale ground invasion is too costly, what about a more targeted option? The New York Post reported this week that Washington is seriously weighing a large-scale special operations mission to seize enriched uranium directly from Iranian nuclear facilities. The scale would be enormous. Thousands of troops needed to secure the facilities, clear booby traps, and protect transport routes. A smaller specialized team would actually retrieve the nuclear material. One expert quoted by the Post called it potentially, and this is a direct quote, the most sophisticated operation in military history. The target sites under consideration is Isfahan, for Dal, and Pickaxe Mountain, the underground complex near Natanz, buried inside solid rock, one of Iran's most heavily fortified installations, still under construction and deepening. And here is the detail that tells you everything. Iran already knows about this option. Iran has reinforced the target sites. And according to reports, Iran has planted explosives inside those facilities in anticipation of exactly this raid scenario. America is considering launching the most complex special forces mission in human history against a target where the enemy is already waiting inside with booby traps. That is not a plan from a side that is winning. That is a plan from a side that has run out of better ideas. And now we arrive at the part that I think is the most important thing I will say today, because this is a thing that nobody in mainstream media is explaining clearly. An Iranian security source told Al Jazeera this week that Iran has drawn up a new target list inside Israel. Not standard military targets. These are, quoting directly, targets that could not be repaired or rebuilt for years. Critical infrastructure, power systems, water networks, financial architecture. Things that, if destroyed, would make Israel functionally unviable as a modern state for an extended period. The source added that striking these targets would accelerate emigration from Israel. That is a specific deliberate statement about the long-term demographic survival of the Israeli state. But here is the structural mechanism that makes this geopolitically explosive. This target list gets activated even if Israel does not directly participate in any attack on Pickaxe Mountain. If the United States strikes Pickaxe Mountain, even unilaterally, even without declared Israeli involvement, Iran responds against Israel anyway. Think about what this means. America strikes Pickaxe Mountain. Iran activates the Israel target list. Israel is hit and forced to retaliate. America gets pulled into a full simultaneous conflict with the entire axis of resistance at once. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and Iranian forces all triggering together. Iran has engineered an automatic escalation mechanism where one American action toward its most sensitive target detonates a regional war that nobody asked for and nobody can stop once it starts. And General Al-Khamenei made this explicit this week. U.S. bases in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain are, in his words, at the center of Iranian retaliatory action, not just bases inside Iran, not just Hormuz. Every country hosting American military infrastructure across the entire region is a potential strike target in the next escalation cycle. So let me summarize part 6. The ceasefire is not peace. It is a reloading pause. 3 options are on the table. Every option creates a worse problem than the previous one. And Iran has already designed a tripwire mechanism that automatically transforms any American strike on Pickaxe Mountain into a regional war with Israel pulled in, whether Washington wants that or not. Does that make sense? Now, I want to talk about a front with no explosions, no drones, and no tanker seizures. But it may be the most dangerous front for American long-term global credibility. Iran is systematically rearming itself using international law as a weapon. And it is doing it with considerable precision. On July 25th, Ukraine attacked 2 Iranian commercial vessels in the Caspian Sea, the Port Olia 2 and the Beje. 1 sailor killed. Ukraine says the ships were carrying military cargo for Russia. Iran immediately invoked Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, the provision prohibiting attacks on civilian vessels, and demanded the Security Council take decisive action against Ukraine. And here is the trap. If the Security Council condemns Ukraine, a Western ally, it shatters NATO's unified narrative that Russia is the sole aggressor in this conflict. But if the Security Council stays silent, Iran has concrete proof that the United Nations only condemns countries that are enemies of America, regardless of what those countries actually did. Either way, Iran wins the narrative war. The precedent for this trap already exists in Security Council Resolution 2817, passed in March 2026. That resolution condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf states as violations of international law. But the resolution said nothing, not one word, about the original American and Israeli airstrikes on Iran and Lebanon that provoked those retaliatory strikes. It condemned the response. It completely ignored the provocation. Iran calls this resolution censorship. And from a strict legal standpoint, they are not wrong. The IAEA run is equally precise. After weeks of American bombing, the International Atomic Energy Agency requested access to inspect Iran's nuclear facilities. Iran refused. And here is the legal argument Iran's nuclear chief Eslami made. Pay attention, because this is genuinely sharp reasoning. He said Iran will not allow inspections until the IAEA establishes clear post-war protocols, including protections for internationally safeguarded nuclear facilities, and formally condemns the American strikes on Iran's civilian nuclear infrastructure. In plain English, you want to inspect our facilities to check that we are not building weapons. But you said nothing when someone bombed those same facilities in violation of international law. You cannot demand our compliance with your rules while staying silent about someone else breaking those same rules when it served their interest. That is a logically airtight position, and it puts the IAEA in an impossible situation from which there is no clean exit. Iran's strategic objective is clear. Strip away the neutral and independent labels from both the UN and the IAEA. Show the global south, 4 billion people watching this conflict, that these are not impartial institutions. They are instruments of Washington. And every time the UN or IAEA fails to act even-handedly, Iran wins another round of that argument without firing a single shot. Now I want to connect every piece of this together, because what is happening is not just about oil prices or sanctions packages or drone strikes. It is about the structural foundation of American global power. The real power of the United States is not aircraft carriers. It is not the B-2 bomber. The real power of the United States is the US dollar and the alliance system that creates demand for that dollar. The petrodollar, the system where global oil must be purchased in US dollars, that is the foundation of American empire. Without that, everything else starts to crumble. Now look at what is happening to that foundation. The European Union is importing Russian LNG through mechanisms that do not necessarily route through the dollar. Kuwait is publicly disavowing military actions conducted from its own territory. Spain refused American military access. Germany refused Hormuz. France refused Gaza. Iran's Foreign Minister Gach met with both Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Kyrgyzstan in the same week, building what Lavrov described as a security mechanism that relies on regional countries. A regional security architecture that does not have America at its center. These are not isolated cracks. These are systematic fractures in a foundation that the petrodollar stands on, and here is the central paradox I want you to carry with you. America attacked Iran to protect the petrodollar system, but that attack is forcing American allies to seek energy independence from American-controlled supply chains, build parallel financial structures, and develop alternative security frameworks, all of which undermine the very petrodollar system America was trying to defend, the self-destroying loop at its highest structural level. Let that sit for a moment. All right. Based on everything I have analyzed today, here are 3 specific things I want you to watch in the next 2 weeks. Point 1, watch the Patriot stockpile. If America announces it is transferring air defense systems from South Korea or European NATO bases to the Middle East, that is a signal the tactical pause is ending and a new escalation cycle is coming. That transfer takes time and political capital. If you see it happen, the ceasefire is over. If you do not see it within 2 weeks, Washington is leaning toward the Omani diplomatic exit ramp. Point 2, watch Israel and the Iran target list. If Israel continues military operations in Lebanon and Gaza, while America is supposedly negotiating, and Iran starts publishing more specific language about targets that cannot be rebuilt for years, that is Iran preparing the Pickaxe Mountain tripwire for activation. The more specific the language gets about Israeli infrastructure targets, the closer we are to a trigger event that nobody planned and nobody will be able to stop once it starts. Point 3. Watch the UN Security Council's response to the Caspian attack. If the Council stays silent about Ukraine striking those Iranian commercial vessels, watch how Iran uses that silence. Arakchi will take that evidence to every non-Western forum he can access, the African Union, ASEAN, the SKO, the Arab League, and use it to demonstrate that international institutions operate on a double standard. Every additional piece of evidence Iran collects on this front strengthens its diplomatic position against America in the eyes of the 4 billion people who are not part of the Western alliance. For homework, read the full legal text of EU Sanctions Package 21. Find the clause about seized vessel oil and read it carefully. Then read UN Security Council Resolution 28. 17 from March 2026, and look at the language it uses about Iranian retaliatory strikes versus the absence of language about the original American and Israeli attacks. Then read the New York Post report about the Special Forces uranium seizure option. After you do all 3, I want you to ask yourself a question. If every military option leads to a worse outcome, if the diplomatic exit requires Israel's permission, if European allies are buying Russian oil behind the scenes while publicly condemning Russia, if the UN and IAEA are functioning as geopolitical instruments rather than neutral institutions, and if Iran has designed a tripwire that automatically escalates any strike on its most sensitive facility into a regional war that pulls in Israel, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias simultaneously, then the real question is not who is winning on the battlefield. When the EU sanctions Russia with one hand and buys Russian oil with the other, when America's own ally uses drones to destroy the alternative pipeline America built to replace Russian oil, when a tactical military pause is dressed as diplomacy because the Patriot stockpile is running dry, when special forces are being considered for what one expert called the most sophisticated operation in military history, against a target that has already been booby-trapped and is waiting, when a single airstrike on a mountain in Iran can automatically trigger a war that pulls Israel in, whether Washington wants it or not, who is actually in control of how this ends? I will see you in the next lecture.